Hello everyone, I'm Jack Fisher and welcome to my world. And whenever anyone talks about artificial intelligence, it's hard to avoid the implications that it will likely have on multiple industries. This isn't as simple as ATM machines putting bank tellers out of work. AI, even if it isn't as intelligent as an average human, has the potential to disrupt, undermine, or flat out replace entire professions. And even if those industries survive, they may take on a radically different form, and not necessarily in a good way. As of the making of this video, many industries are vulnerable, but they haven't been affected yet. But many more will become vulnerable as this AI technology improves. But the one I feel is more vulnerable than most, even without further refinements to AI, is the comic book industry. Me being a lifelong comic fan, as well as a general fan of superhero media, this does concern me a great deal. And I know I'm not the only one with these concerns. More than a few fans have expressed this sentiment. But it really wasn't until the spring of 2024 that those concerns started to manifest, albeit in a minor way. DC Comics, one of the big two publishers in the industry, was actually accused of utilizing AI for 3 covers of upcoming comics. And these weren't minor titles either. These were covers for ongoing series like Wonder Woman, Power Girl, and Shazam. Officially, each one of these covers was commissioned by an artist, namely Zhang Gao. And when the accusations came out, Gao made it a point to share early sketches of the covers to prove that they were not products of AI. But even if Gao was being truthful, and there's little reason to believe otherwise, the damage was already done. DC Comics still ended up replacing the covers by commissioning new art from 3 well-known artists. And these will be the covers readers see when they purchase these issues, be it digital or trade paperbacks. So for this particular incident, everything was resolved as well as anyone could have hoped for. DC Comics addressed the concerns directly, and they commissioned new artwork from well-known artists, which likely resulted in spending money that they probably would have preferred to save. And the fact that DC did this on a mere accusation, and one that wasn't even confirmed, that really says a lot about the current sentiments towards AI art. I know I've shared my sentiments about this sort of thing in the past. I also freely admit that I use AI art in many of my videos. However, I'm just a guy with a YouTube channel. DC Comics is one of the biggest publishers in the comic book industry. What they do in that industry and how they go about it, that's bound to have a much greater impact. And that's exactly why this is worth talking about, because even if you're not a fan of DC Comics or comic books in general, this should be concerning. It really does show where the public's attitudes towards AI are at the moment. It also sends a clear message that people are aware of the temptation to use AI in this industry. Whether or not DC Comics actually used AI to make those covers, that's actually beside the point. Because you really don't need to weave elaborate conspiracy theories to surmise how AI art generators could disrupt the comic book industry. Because if you've ever commissioned artwork for anything, be it a website, a book, or some personal project, you probably know the costs involved. I myself have some personal experience with this process. Years ago, I needed to commission some artwork for some novels that I wrote. And I learned early on that if you want something that looks professional, you need to spend a few $100s at least, and that was back in 2012. Even some small-time artists I met at New York Comic Con couldn't afford to be cheap. Some still charge $50 to $90 just for a single commissioned piece. And again, those are rates from the early 2010s. You can safely assume those rates have gone up by necessity. And like any other service or product, you tend to get what you pay for. You just can't be overly frugal in commissioning artwork and expect quality on par with Jim Lee, David Gibbons, or Brian Ballard. This applies just as much to big-name publishers like Marvel and DC. They frequently pay extra to lock certain artists into contracts so that they provide artwork exclusively for them. This is how a lot of top-name artists make their living. And lesser-known artists can only break in by getting those paid commissions, building their portfolio, and establishing a brand. But this current system that has served the comics industry for years could be completely upended by AI art generators, even in their current form. It's just a matter of whether publishers choose to pursue that path and whether consumers choose to accept it. Even before this latest incident with DC Comics, the disruptive potential of AI was demonstrated. In September 2023, a social media user with no affiliation to any publisher used AI to create a simple Batman comic. The comic itself was only 4 panels. It was also in black and white. But it utilized Dall-E 3, one of the most well-known AI art generators on the market. And say what you will about the quality, and yes, there's plenty to say, but the fact remains that these 4 panels were easily produced by an ordinary person using a publicly available program. There was no commission paid, no artist to compensate. And if one random person online could do this, what would stop a major company with far greater resources and incentives? What ended up stopping that small Batman comic from going anywhere was the backlash that ensued. Multiple artists, including those not affiliated with DC Comics, called the user out, as well as the technology they utilized. And yeah, they were right to be concerned. These 4 panels took less than 5 minutes to render. What they rendered wasn't unique. It was largely derived from the past works of other artists, of which Batman has had many. Many critics would call this kind of artwork soulless, akin to just tracing the work of another artist and only tweaking a few minor details. You can call that subjective or even a little petty, but it reflects what might be an important guardrail for the industry and this technology. In the case of that aforementioned Batman comic, as well as the 3 covers I mentioned earlier, a backlash was triggered as soon as people were aware that AI art was utilized or even suspected. That current stigma surrounding AI art seriously hinders major publishers from fully pursuing it. Marvel, DC, and other publishers know there would be a major public outcry if they announced that they were going to start using AI to produce comics. And even if they said it meant the comics would be cheaper, or that they would be able to produce more each month, it would still be detrimental overall to their business. It might even be impractical given the current limitations of AI art generators. That 4-panel Batman comic was fairly crude and simple, and that kind of quality just wouldn't work for most consumers in the long run. But, and I've made this point in other videos about AI, these AI art generators will continue to improve, and that improvement won't be gradual either. The incentives, the mechanisms, and the architecture are all in place. AI tools of all kinds are going to keep getting better, and since AI art generators are more mature compared to other forms of AI, the comic book industry would be an easy target for disruption. To illustrate, just consider the following scenario. In an effort to cut costs and produce more content, Marvel and DC decide that embracing AI is worth the risk of public backlash. So, using their vast library of content going back decades, they feed every panel of every comic into a new AI art generator as training data. Then, after a period of refinement and development, they start utilizing prompts to generate covers, panels, and even entire pages. Eventually, it gets refined to a point where one individual with an AI art generator can produce the output of 10 commissioned artists. That significantly decreases the cost for producing an average comic. Since the companies are the ones providing the training data, any new story, concept, or character that emerges as a result of these AIs is theirs. And since no human technically created it, the company owns it and don't need to compensate any artists or their estates. Over time, their AI art generator continues to improve by learning from each result. Ultimately, it gets to a point where producing a comic from a single script is so simple that they don't even need to employ regular artists. At most, they need only contract graphic designers to clean up renderings as needed. Now, this scenario, as of the making of this video, is not feasible even if public backlash wasn't a concern. The AI art generators in use today would not be able to produce comics at the quality major and minor publishers alike require. And even with the best generators on the market, it's still relatively easy for most people to identify artwork that is rendered by AI. But, a few years from now, the temptation might be too much to ignore. As someone who has used AI art generators for a while now, I can attest to how rapidly they've improved. It used to be that you could easily identify AI art just by looking at the weird hands of any figure that was rendered. But that issue is addressed more and more with each model. And even in cases when a rendering isn't perfect, it really doesn't take much skill to polish it up in Photoshop. This is how it might initially start in the comics industry. Regular commissioned art would still be utilized, but for the sake of meeting deadlines and demand, AI programs might be used to finish or modify certain artwork. However, these programs really only need to become good enough, not perfect, to supplant those artists. And all of that assumes that big publishers like Marvel and DC aren't above screwing over artists. Now, if you know anything about the history of the comics industry, then you understand why that's not a safe assumption. Just look at Marvel's many legal issues with the estate of Jack Kirby as a prime example. But there are other legal considerations that I don't doubt Marvel and DC are aware of. Back in February 2023, a writer named Chris Castanova used Midjourney to create artwork for his comic, Zyra of the Dawn. However, when he applied for a copyright with the US Patent Office, it was rejected. In their statement, they indicated that the authorship is protected by copyright. However, the images in the work that were generated by Midjourney technology are not the product of human authorship. And that precedent is probably a far bigger concern for major publishers than any public backlash over AI art. Because even before the dominance of superhero movies at the box office, Major comic publishers derived most of their value from copyrighted IP. That's why companies like Disney and Warner Brothers actively fight to extend copyright protections to ensure that their IP doesn't end up in the public domain. While the merit of that fight is an issue in and of itself, it's a major factor for any company that utilizes AI art. But who's to say that precedent will remain in place? Remember, these comic book publishers are subsidies of massive media companies. They have the incentives and the lawyers necessary to lobby for new laws. But some of those laws might not even be necessary, especially as AI art generators become more capable. But even without any changes to those laws, there's not much stopping Marvel, DC, or any publisher from using these tools to cut corners or reduce costs. Even if the savings are minor, it really doesn't take much for any company to pursue the opportunity, even if it means upending the industry as it currently stands. Would this result in the comic book industry being utterly destroyed? Reduced to little more than office temps using prompts to make pages upon pages of generic content? That still remains to be seen. But will the entire makeup of the industry be affected by AI art at some point in the near future? That's practically a certainty. I don't claim to know what the solution is here. Right now, all consumers and artists can do is continue stigmatizing any use of AI art that undermines the work of real artists and writers at these publishers. There's also a solid legal precedent in place about AI art and copyright law that offers more robust protections. But nobody should assume that precedent will remain in place indefinitely. As with any new technology, we must adapt. That certainly extends to the comic book industry as well, and every major publisher in comics will have to start adapting sooner than most forms of media. How they do this, how artists, writers, and consumers alike will ultimately respond, I guess only time will tell. Thanks for watching, everyone, and thanks for joining me in my world. Just remember to like, comment, and subscribe. Until next time, take care and stay safe.